Okay, well, thanks everyone for joining. My name is Owen Bondurant. I'm a partner here at Independent RX. This webinar today is how to transfer and close licenses, insurance contracts, and your corporation when you're selling your pharmacy. If you do not know our company, we're Independent RX. We primarily do three things. We help people start and buy pharmacies. We do accounting and tax for pharmacies. And why we're here today, we help people sell pharmacies. I've got my business partner, Tim, with me today. I'll let him introduce himself.
Hi, thank you, Owen. My name is Tim Clark. I'm a third generation pharmacist and a partner with Owen with Independent RX Consulting. And we also own a couple of pharmacies together here in Ohio. And my primary role is to look at people who are transitioning their business and help them prepare to do that, and then figure out transition plans so that they can sell it. The purpose of today's lesson is to explain to people that even when you're selling your pharmacy, that there's things that you have to do to transition the business. It's not as simple as depositing a check.
Yeah, so thanks. Just a couple housekeeping items. We are recording this. We will post it on LinkedIn, send it out on an email, put it on our website. So if you miss anything or want to revisit it, it will be out there. There's also a Q&A down at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to drop questions in there. We will answer them as we go or at the end. So feel free to drop questions in there. So, all right. What's our first topic?
Well, I think the first thing, Owen, and what's kind of great about this is I think usually on this we take two different sides of this transaction, and usually I think when you help someone buy a store, they're aware that there's going to be licensing and DEA, NPI, insurance things that need to be changed. But one of the discussions that we always have with people who are selling is, well, what am I responsible for? So I guess let's start off with, so if I'm going to sell my pharmacy, Ellen, what do I have to take care of with the State Board of Pharmacy and the DEA?
Okay, yeah. So the State Board of Pharmacy will well, will vary depending on the type of sale, and then also what state you're in. But and I'll kind of go through that. But in generalities, with the state, it's your responsibility to go either contact your inspector, contact the board, go online and find out if you need to notify the state of your sale occurring. In some states, you have to notify them 30 days prior to the sale. It's a
It,
it's it's a legal regulatory. In other states, you
it,
don't have to notify them at all.
are typically the state's boards of pharmacy aware of this, and are they pretty used to working with you on these kind of situations?
Yeah, for the most part, they are. Yes, they know exactly what's going. Like if you email them, a lot of times they write back a canned email with here's exactly what has to happen.
Okay.
Um, but it will vary from a state board standpoint on what state board you're in. So, for example, in California, they have to approve the transaction before you close. Whereas in Texas, you don't even need to tell them until after the sale occurs. So, and sometimes that is just an email and you just let them know. In other cases, you have to fill out an entire application prior to the sale, or the buyer does, and you have to sign it as the seller saying, yes, I'm selling my pharmacy. Um, and that's in particular when you're selling to an independent or another owner operator. In a chain sale, a lot of times you need to notify the board that you're just going to be shutting down because they want to know where those scripts are going to go and that those patients are going to take care of. So in a chain sale, I would reach out to the state board no matter what.
And then what happens on then, some of the national things that we've got, like your DEA license, in particular, that seems to be one that I know whenever we've transitioned, like I've got to obviously do a C2 inventory and a controlled inventory. Um, what are the typical reporting guidelines on that?
Yeah, so one thing on the state board, sometimes the state board, to your point, also needs those control reports or an inventory report.
Okay.
Um, and then also in some states, for example, like Iowa, you have to notify every patient that you're selling your pharmacy 2 weeks prior. So just make sure you contact your board and understand exactly what your responsibility is. Now, flipping back over to the DEA has a rule that they must be notified 14 days prior to the sale. That can be a simple email or letter that's mailed to them, stating that you're selling it and who you're selling it to, but they must be notified 14 days prior to the sale. In most of the time, you won't hear from them. They will never acknowledge it. You'll never know that they received it. Other times they will reach out and say, hey, we need to do an inspection before you close. So that does occasionally happen, in particular in Florida.
Can I transfer over when I sell my NPI or my NCPDP number?
Yes. So that's the one license in all cases that you can transfer. So the buyer can keep your NPI and NCBDP. They don't have to. They can also go get a new one, but they can keep your NPI and NCBDP. And yeah.
Are those things that I see a lot in these transactions where we've got to get a power of attorney? Would that take care of like those things or not?
To a point. So I guess with power of attorney, let's explain exactly what that is. Essentially, that is a document saying the buyer can use you, the seller's licenses, state board, DEA, Medicaid, NPI, and CBDP, right? So it's a power of attorney. Think like power of attorney, like if you're taking care of a parent or something, you can do all of their, you can use their bank accounts and etc. This is specific to the licenses. It's a misconception that a power of attorney works for everything. Some states don't allow them. So, for example, Ohio does not allow a power of attorney. You must notify the state board prior and get a new license at closing. They do not allow a power of attorney. So your power of attorney then would only be for a DEA, NPI, NCBDP, maybe Medicaid. Some Medicaids also don't allow power of attorney. For example, Florida, they don't allow one. But you need to have one in place regardless if you're doing an asset or a stock sale. So a common question we get is, okay, I'm doing a stock sale. The buyer's just taking over everything. I'm done. Well, that's not true because sometimes the state license number still changes in a stock sale. So does the DEA. So for example, we did the transaction in Missouri, and in Missouri, they change the controlled substance license, which triggers a DEA change automatically. And so the stock sale really started them over on everything. And in a stock sale, if you haven't notified or if the insurance contracts, the state board, the DEA, if they don't know that you did a change of ownership and an application hasn't been sent, they still see you as owning it. So there still has to be a power of attorney in place.
Do you like when you sell, what about your PSAO that you're using? I know some people think that automatically it just continues, but it seems like sometimes you have problems of making sure that you still get paid or that you need a reverse claim still that are not taken care of prior to the transaction. Is there any easy way to not screw that up?
Well, number one would be not to close everything down. So we see a lot of people like we'll be on the seller side or we'll be on the buyer side, and the seller will come to us and be like, okay, well, I'm submitting uh, a, a discontinuation of my number. Well, if you discontinue your number right at the sale, you can't go back and rebill anything. You can't do anything. So you don't want to shut everything down like immediately.
Yeah,
Uh,
I think we've had that also happen in North Carolina with a state Medicaid. You have to
correct.
be really, really careful in terms of explaining to them what you're doing, or you could end up without any coverage and you're still open.
That is correct. Yeah. So they need to so for example, MPI and NCBDP is one that can really, really cause some problems. So if you do the change of ownership on the day of closing, that MPI and NCBDP is now associated with a new owner, and their insurance contracts won't work because the insurance company's going, you haven't done a change of ownership for this new MPI and NCBDP. So you want to change that date. You want to push it out 90, 120 days, so that you, as the seller, continue to get paid and you're not shut down. Because if you shut everything down, we all know the PBMs won't pay you. They're happy not to pay you. They don't pay you already. So if
Yeah,
you cancel
I
that
think
stuff, yeah,
yeah, another interesting thing I think have seen that happens to a seller even has to do with your wholesaler being your PSAO. I mean, like if you have money outstanding to your wholesaler, they can take money is due to you from your insurance companies through the PSAO that's kind of acting as your lockbox, and they can withhold payment to the owner, which doesn't really seem fair, but we must have signed a contract along the way that lets them do that.
correct. So um, when you notify all of them becomes tricky because if you're selling to another individual, the wholesalers in a stock or asset sale are going to make you set up a new account, the buyer. It's a misconception from a seller standpoint. The sellers always think that, oh, well, we have a power of attorney. Now you can order drugs under my licenses, under my wholesale account. The wholesalers are not allowed to do that. They have regulations in place with the DEA and a lot of the times the state boards that prevent them from doing that. So you have to tell your wholesaler before you close, but they may hold back your money.
Yeah.
So you need to make sure that they know you're going to pay them off, or they will hold back some of your AR if your PSAO is associated with them. Um,
You started to talk about this a little bit earlier, when, um, stock sale versus asset sales. And, and typically, obviously, if someone's going to take over your business, that could be a stock sale, and some states require that.
yep,
In other instances, you've got asset sales to individuals that are going to take over your pharmacy, or you could be selling it to, let's say, a bigger store that's just buying files and inventory. Um, Licensing thing from a seller's point of view, it's still the same, right? You still have to tell people this is happening.
yeah, you and I went through this when I bought into the pharmacies. We had to get my dad out, and I own a small percentage, right? And we still had to fill out paperwork for state board. I think DEA we didn't have to because that one's done at Corp. MPI, NCBDP, Caremark, PSAO, um,
Mm-hmm.
Humana, Express Scripts, Medicaid. So we had to go through and essentially fill out a change of ownership for all of those, even though I only bought a little bit of the stock. So if you do 100% stock, it's still that still needs to be done. And you as the seller, a lot of times have to sign off um, that you uh, have sold the pharmacy and that it is all true. So
Right. And but again, the whole idea that, one is easier than another is, would you say that's just not really true? It's just even I think from what I've learned on the whole tax side of things, I mean, there's like your worst taxing thing when you're going to sell your business is to be in a C corp, right?
yes,
That's the one that has the most strings attached to everything you sell. But if you're, let's say, an S corp, your tax attorney or CPA can kind of help you create a strategy to minimize that taxation, right?
that is correct. So I think people get too caught up on that. I mean, there are circumstances, like you said, with C corps where stock sales make sense, or states like Florida where you almost have to do it. But it doesn't, from a licensing and insurance contract, it doesn't give you as many advantages as you think. I mean, the buyer doesn't have to set up a new bank account and they take that over from you. So you don't have to close down a bank account. Sometimes car titles are you don't have to do anything with, though we had one recently where the seller thought the car was in the business's name and it wasn't. So they still had to do a car title change. Um, so the whole stock versus asset thing, I think sellers always think that stock sales are so much easier and they're just not. Uh,
Would you say then that really the regulatory requirements are fairly similar?
yes,
It's maybe just a different form, but people who you're doing business with, or who regulate us, you need to be told of a change.
that is correct.
Um, Now, when it comes to regulatory requirements for, let's say, um, I don't know, selling to a chain or an independent, everybody, always seems to think, oh, it's so much easier to sell to a chain. But is that kind of a misconception?
Um, yeah, to a point, because with the chain, you, the seller, are actually going to have to fill out more of the paperwork, right?
That's
So,
correct. Yeah, that's right.
right. So let's take the state board. The chain isn't closing down your state board license, you are. Whereas if you sold to an individual, they're probably going to fill out the state board application and the change of ownership. Same with DEA, you have to shut it down. MPI, you shut it down. NCBDP, you shut it down. Insurance contracts, you shut those down or let them lapse. So, like, it's more on you to deal with closing everything down over time. And again, with that situation, you don't want to do that like the day of closing. Sometimes you have to let the board and DEA and stuff know that you're doing that. But if everything gets turned off, again, PBMs and stuff could say, well, you weren't licensed on this date, and so we're not paying you. So you want to make sure that you kind of push that out a little bit further than you probably think that you should. So it is not necessarily easier. Sometimes it can be quicker, but it's not necessarily easier. And as you know, with a chain, a lot of times they don't buy your OTC inventory. Maybe you own a building and you got to sell that off. So there's non-license and regulatory things that get complicated with a chain.
Yeah, it seems like again with the chain, the easiest thing is that you don't have to worry about them going through approval with financing. They have
Yep.
to get approval by typically it's whatever their committee is to approve the purchase. And I guess what we've seen is that it's interesting how the operators of, let's say, that local chain have an input to whether they're going to buy your store or not. They're going to ask that local operator if like what you're doing is professional, is there anything sketchy, just to get a background. They're going to look at when they buy your business, they're going to put it into that individual store's P&L, and they're going to have to pay for it. So so you have less people that need to make the decision, but you have people still that you don't know, just like dealing with a bank, that have to make a decision.
Sure.
Um, and your wind down costs, which I think, we've tried to help people understand that. Like typically before we get to a closing, everybody wants to know, what are my wind down costs, right? Whether it's like my lease, my improvements, heck, you could still have some automation or
Yeah.
some other contract that you got into with, let's say it could be your cable contract, your internet contract, your um, and then you need to turn off all your professional liability insurances on a certain date.
Correct. And along with liability insurance, again, it's another um, question that we get a lot is the sellers assume the buyers can just take over their liability insurance in a stock and in an asset sale. And an asset sale, you definitely can't. When you sell it, that insurance is done. So the buyer needs to be insured prior to buying it, and banks will require that. In a stock sale, I know that they're insuring your corporation, but the insurance companies typically want to re-underwrite that. And so don't be surprised if the buyer comes to you and says, "Hey, I need to contact your insurance company to make sure I can take over your liability insurance." Um, yeah. Um,
Yeah.
we have a question here. Someone asked, assuming no buyer lined up, and when you have a buyer lined up, how long do you propose starting each process? Do you have a handy timeline graph available on each step of the process? So first off, yes, if you work with us, we have an online portal and we customize that to your state and your deal and so forth that takes you through each step and when they should be done. Um, in terms of when you start this, it's kind of a weird question because we would advise you to have a purchase agreement in place before you go do any of this. You don't really want to go tell the state board and the DEA and the wholesaler and all this different people when you're not 100% sure there's a deal reached.
Yeah, and to take that even further, Owen, I'd say that you need a signed purchase agreement.
Yes,
You,
yes, sorry.
like just
That-
because you've exchanged a purchase agreement, it isn't signed. And everybody kind of has this idea that, oh, I don't sign it until I close. That's not how it works. Think of it like when you buy your house, and we use that a lot when we talk about buying and selling a pharmacy. Some similarities, some not. But look at, like, when you're buying that house, you're signing a purchase agreement to buy the house. Like, you don't start, transitioning and lining up the movers until things are like, for instance, conditions to closing, I think is a fair way to explain it.
Yep.
You need to get the
Yep.
document signed, whether it be with a chain or an individual who's ever going to buy it. And then you start the process of, let's say, figuring out the timeline of shutting things down. And all of it really comes down to when the thing's going to close.
Right.
And lots of times, you can get some people, and I'd probably tell you this, I don't know if I'd sign a purchase agreement until I had financing approved. I mean, I'm not going to countersign your purchase agreement if you're buying my store until I know you got the money, because, like, that's even though, yes, it's still not valid, it is a condition to closing, but that's a really big condition to me closing.
Yeah.
Like, I want to make sure that you've got the financing approved and that you've got a lender commitment, right?
Yep. And yeah, no, I totally agree. And in terms of when you do all this, I mean, again, like the actual notifications, financing needs to be in place and a purchase agreement needs to be signed before you go notify. And that might take 30 to 45 days after you sign that purchase agreement to do all of that. Um, Now, you can do some legwork. So, for example, you could call the state board and say, "Hey, I'm looking to sell. What is the process?" So that you know what it is. You don't need the purchase agreement to do that. Um, but the actual notifications should not occur until your sure finance, how are they going to pay for it? And do we have an agreed document signed on a purchase agreement?
Well, when would you, so me as the seller, and I think we both could answer this, but I'm going to ask you. So me as the seller, when do I tell my landlord that my store's for sale, or that I need to re-up this lease, or um, obviously that's another big thing for a seller that he's going to have to think about, right?
Yep.
Because it can mess up a deal.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, an attorney would tell you wait until you have a purchase agreement. I think some of that depends on your relationship with your landlord. I mean, if you know the landlord well, you might say, "Hey, I'm looking to sell. Can I introduce you to the buyer?" But you also don't want the deal to fall through, and then your landlord starts getting nervous that you're gonna close down or leave or things like that, and now doesn't want to renew with you. And I mean, it can cause problems. So again, you probably want a purchase agreement in place before you go tell all these people that you are selling.
Some things like in that lease that let's say if I know I'm going to sell in a couple of years, what really do I need to have in my lease, or is there any advice that you can give me to, like, as I'm preparing to sell in the future? Because like I know some of this stuff, you can like almost prevent by making sure that you have things like the right to us, to have somebody else assume your lease, right?
Yep. Yeah, if you have the ability to assume your lease or assign it, that makes it easier. If you're looking at banks, if your buyer's using a bank, SBA requires that they have a loan for the length. I'm sorry, a lease for the length of the loan, which is typically 10
Right.
years. And that could be a 5-year lease with a 5-year option to renew. So having your lease go out 10 or 15 years makes it easier for the landlord just to assign it to the buyer and will speed up your process of selling. Uh,
Okay.
we do have another question. Someone asked, earlier, I was talking about liability insurance, and they're asking, won't you still be protected as a seller as long as the general liability is under occurrence-based policy? Yes, that is true. Um, you are covered up until closing, and as long as you're paying them, actually, um, for things that happen prior to the closing because you paid insurance. What we were pointing out, and what we hear a lot is sellers assume that a buyer can simply pay their insurance policies and it will stay in force. That is not true. So the buyer a lot of times has to go get a new policy prior to closing in order to make sure they're covered going forward. So don't be surprised if they ask you to contact your liability insurance provider to get a new policy.
Yeah, they're going to check on that, because you need that to, if you're going to get who's ever going to buy your business, and that, let's say they get a bank note, they're going to need that to do it. They may even need to call your who's ever doing your liability to find out, if you've had any run on the policy, like whether you've had any exposure to claims. So that is something, again, depending upon if you're selling it to we'll call it an existing business who's doing a file buy. You don't have to worry about that as much, because the file buy people have that. So you as a seller just have to look at, when do I need to cancel this? And really, I guess it would be my understanding is it depends which part you're canceling. There's the professional liability. If you're not filling more prescriptions, you don't need that. But typically in our policy, it also includes things like the windows, floods, fire, those basic building things. And that has to be maintained. If you're responsible for your lease, in that building, you're still responsible to have insurance as part of your lease. So
Yeah, that's a good point.
it's not as simple as you think. And I think that's where, again, it's nice to have somebody kind of help you who's done it.
Yeah. Yeah, I didn't even think about that. If you're like, for example, if you sell to a chain and you still are leasing the building, you have to keep liability insurance in place. You can't just shut it down. Um, Now you might be able to get a lower tier, but you still need insurance. We have more
Mhm.
questions coming in here. Any concern over when to retire seller's DEA number in a stock sale? Um, well, so the way that works is you will apply to the state board first for a change of ownership. Again, sometimes that's done prior to the sale, sometimes it's done after. Once the state board signs off on it, the buyer that the, the buyer will submit a change of ownership for a DEA, and the DEA will issue a new DEA number and they will retire the DEA. There isn't a time frame for that, so it's not like MPI and CBDP where you need to put it 90 days out. But there is a process for it. And then again, with the DEA, you have to notify them 14 days prior to the sale, but it will not impact insurance contracts or anything.
Well, sometimes I think people get confused over that power of attorney, Ellen. Like when it
Yes.
comes to things like that, that they think that, okay, I'm going to give you a power of attorney for 45 days. And it ends up that really I'm going to have to come back to you sometimes to ask for an extension on that because some things take longer than what we think. Well, I guess that's a lot of things in life. They always take longer. So don't be surprised. Like your attorney will probably put a limit to the power of attorney, which is normal. But also, I mean, I've had situations even with ourselves where we've had to grant an extension.
Yeah, and then that's pretty common. Standard is 45 days, but it often gets extended to 90 or longer due to the insurance companies taking forever, in particular Caremark and Medicaid. Um, let's see, it says, can you take the buyer side and recommended action steps to transfer the license? Yes, we represent buyers too. That's a third of our business is doing buyers. We also represent sellers and we do accounting and tax. So in many cases, we are representing the buyer um, uh, for clients and we're not representing the seller. Sometimes we do both, and sometimes it's just the seller that we're representing. So frankly, no matter who we're representing, we end up getting involved in this because if we're representing the seller, we need to make sure the buyer does everything right to make sure the seller's in compliance. And if we're representing the buyer, we need to make sure the seller doesn't do something that will cause the buyer to lose insurance contracts or what have you. So kind of end up involved in this no matter what.
Yep, that makes sense.
I have another question. It says, will seller need lawyer in addition to you? Yes, you will need an attorney. We prefer that you get one that has pharmacy and healthcare experience because all these things we're talking about need to be outlined in the purchase agreement. And if they're not, it can cause problems for you down the line. And then also that same person asked, what is your sales fee schedule? So what do we charge?
Typically, and again, it's a 6% commission of whatever we're selling, and typically that includes goodwill and inventory. If it's a stock sale, it could include something more than that. Um, we do have a minimum we charge, and that's a minimum that's like $20,000. It could be higher than that. Sometimes your business, doesn't sell for as much as you want, and the problem is that it still requires us to have to spend time and help you. We even sometimes will come in to help you after you've got something with the chain. Lots of you get a lot of emails and walk-ins from chains trying to still purchase your pharmacy, You might think that now, let's say the big chains like CVS and Walgreens aren't buying pharmacies because they're closing stores, but that's not true. They're still buying. They're just kind of buying them differently. And that just continues to happen. So, we do represent people who do that. And just like anything, like if you're going to use somebody, you should use somebody who's got some experience doing it. Our basic difference is that not only have we um, done it for other people, we've done it for ourselves, which I think gives us a unique viewpoint of what should happen. And also in our business, that we help buyers and sellers is a different spin. Most people who are doing this don't help you buy a store. So I think we've got a little bit unique visibility, and you add on the fact that we also have an ongoing service to help accounting is just yeah, we're still involved in the business of pharmacy, so we have some good recommendations and help. But you do, back to your question, you do need an attorney. Yes, we are not attorneys.
Yeah, we pretty much do everything but the attorney piece.
Cannot do that.
And they are needed, believe it or not.
And they do need, and they will listen to our advice. I mean,
Yes.
like sometimes they won't have as much experience, and they will ask some advice. Or that's the thing about your attorney is you got to remember they are there to protect you, and we're here to protect you too, but we don't have that legal standing. I can't protect you from a lawsuit or errors of omission or something like that. Those are all things that attorneys do to make sure that the transaction is fair for you and protect you and your family.
Okay. Did we cover everything, or we?
Every time we look at these, I think that it should last about 10 minutes, and here it is 40 minutes in.
Yes, so that's plenty of time. I'm sure you need to get back to filling prescriptions. Thanks for joining us. If you have questions, our website is independentrxconsulting.com. You can also find me, Owen Bondurant, and Tim Clark on LinkedIn. Reach out. You can schedule a call with us right on our website. Thanks for joining us, and we'll have another one here in about a month, so look out for our email.
Great. Thanks, Owen. Thanks, everybody.